أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. In the name of Allah, the compassionate, the most merciful. All praise is due to Allah, and may His peace and blessings be upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Wherever you are, whatever time it may be for you, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May the peace and the blessings of Allah be upon all of you and your loved ones, Ya Rabbil Alameen. And thank you once again for joining us here on Let Us Talk About It, where we really do like to talk about it. Great to have you with us. So very generous of you to invite us to your homes every Thursday evening, as we do every week. And this week we do have a really, really important topic with a really credible guest. We will be talking about marriage. You know, since this whole COVID thing started, there's a lot of talks as to how COVID impacted families. I know I've been contacted about the rise in domestic violence. I've been contacted about potential rise in divorce rates and what is going on and how is COVID impacting our marriages. So we'll be talking about marriages, relationships. We'll be talking about how COVID has impacted our relationships. And for this topic, we really do have a good guest. I'm really excited about her being with us this evening, Sister Menahal Begawala. Menahal is a licensed mental health counselor in the New York area. She has completed her marriage counseling training through the Gottman Institute. I've been talking about Gottman for so long, and I've been talking about how this guy predicts whether couples are going to stay together or not. Menahal, we want to talk to you about this as well. Menahal has a very impressive resume, mashallah, lots and lots of training, as you can see. So she's also trained and has become a practitioner of EMDR. By the way, I've always wanted to do this, never got a chance and got around to do it, which is another modality of treating trauma, which is her specialty, by the way. She does workshops on parenting, wellness, marriage, and addictions, amongst others. She is currently practicing in the New York area, and I believe that you're also applying for your license in New Jersey. Please do refer to the rest of this very, very impressive bio, inshallah. Menahal, thank you for joining us, and it is good to have you.
Assalamu alaikum. It's my pleasure to be here, Shaykh. Jazakallahu khairan for having me.
Jazana wa iyyakum. And I know that it's late for you. It's East Coast time, so apologies for keeping us late, but really appreciate your presence here with us today.
It's worth it to be up for this, alhamdulillah.
Jazakallah khair. All right, so just every time people ask me, more sisters are in this field than there are brothers. What is the appeal? So, looking for counselors, and alhamdulillah, we're not complaining that we have sisters in the field, but we're looking into what is the appeal for the sisters and why are not more men in this field?
I'd like to ask brothers that question to see why don't they pursue this. I think there's something about being in a helping profession that appeals to women's nature, perhaps. I don't actually know. I'd be curious to read some research on this myself. But what I do know is that this profession, it takes a lot, and it takes depending on the route you go. I don't know if stereotypically, I can't say, there are so many different modalities of how households are set up now, so I don't want to make a blanket statement, but typically speaking, this profession could, but not necessarily, it's not definite that it will be a lucrative position. It can be, but so I don't know if that's maybe why the brothers don't go into it. I know we definitely need more men. I also think that culturally, a lot of times we see that the emotional stuff is more stereotypically given to women to handle, even, when children are crying, comforting them, these kinds of soft skills, usually we allot them to women. And so I don't know if that's why, but I definitely know that it's important, and we're seeing a growing need. We're seeing a growing just the effects of fathers who are not emotionally in tune with their children. We're seeing the effects of that more and more as I see adults who in their childhoods didn't have that. So the need for men, husbands, fathers, brothers to have that emotional skill set and to build emotional intelligence is definitely something that we have to work on as a community.
Nice. And I, whenever I think of people usually asking me if I can refer them to therapists or counselors, I don't remember ever that I came across a brother. I'm not saying that there are no brothers who are licensed, but maybe I know maximum of 2 or 3. But as far as the sisters are concerned, I can go on naming at least 10 licensed therapists who are sisters in our community. And we are happy and blessed to have you. And I think that this is, like you said, it's a skill, it's a profession, credentials that are absolutely needed in our community. And we hope and we wish that more brothers would join in that field. Okay. The other question that people ask me is, there is this interest in knowing, so what kind of cases do you get? What kind of people do you deal with? And now I get to ask you that. Okay. So people want to know, so as counselors, what is it that we're dealing with? What are the if you being a counselor that mainly sees the Muslim community or the Muslim community is exposed to you, if you were to talk about common issues that are brought up within the Muslim community as you see them, what would that look like?
So my 2 areas of specialty came organically through the issues that I was seeing. So the first is marriage and issues within marriage. Alhamdulillah, I do some, public speaking on the event. So I get contacted from across the world for, interventions to help couples get along better. So there's definitely a need in terms of helping couples in the Muslim community, educating them on before they get married in terms of what they should be talking about and looking for to really, really ensure that they're on the same trajectory in the long run, that they have that emotional intelligence, as I mentioned, right, on both parts. So that's one of the big things that I see. And the second is trauma. There's just so much emotional wounding that people carry. And it's not just Muslims, it's across the board. By virtue of being human, we have emotional wounding. There's not a single one of us who's left unscathed by that. That's part of living in this dunya. And so that's another big piece of what I saw that, and I kept seeing it. And as I worked with clients, I was I was teaching some of my supervisees today. And I was telling them that, everywhere I went, I worked in a substance abuse facility, I worked in a private practice, Muslim clients, non-Muslim clients, trauma was there across the board. And so and just talking to them about it, I saw it wasn't helping. And so I felt ethically obligated to pursue that route as well. And so those are the 2 big things that I see, the marriage stuff, and then related to that is the wounding that comes from our relationships.
Got it. And inshallah, we will get back to speaking about the marriage part, which is going to be our focus here for tonight. But I had a couple of questions to you about trauma. And by the way, if any of our viewers out there want to ask a question, please do feel free to use the chat box on your YouTube as I am looking at it. People are saying Salaam alaikum, wa alaikum salam wa barakatuh. Please do use that, inshallah, to ask questions. So the way that you speak about trauma, and you speak about people being wounded, to the average person, when we think of trauma, we're talking about like some traumatic event. You're talking about somebody been in a car accident, or war, people who survived the war-torn civil war. I mean, when you say trauma, what comes to my mind versus your mind versus just people out there? So what is trauma? What kind of trauma are you talking about?
Great. And I'm glad you asked that question, because you're right. Those big things, war, an accident, rape, these are traumas. They are, occurrences that are overwhelming for a person's nervous system, right? They're not natural occurrences that the brain knows how to handle. when I'm talking about trauma, I do include those things, but there's also an entire field of study on what's called attachment trauma or attachment wounding. And that's the pain that comes from repeated over time relational injuries, right? So we're talking about abuse, verbal, emotional, psychological abuse. We're talking about neglect. If there's a child that grows up in a home and, they get their food and shelter, but no one ever speaks to them. No one ever, and this actually, I get concerned because we're increasingly connected to our screens, especially now with COVID as well. Children are increasingly connected to their screens, and our social relationships are so foundational in our physical health, in our mental health, emotional health. And so when I talk about trauma, I do mean those big things, but I'm also talking about the impact of, what happens to us in relationships that ends up shifting our worldview, that ends up, coloring how we see our place in the world and how we show up in the world as well.
Does culture play a role in this? Because just the way that you're speaking right now, okay, so verbal, okay, so, most people would tell you, especially those of us who grew up in Eastern cultures, being called names, just that was just part of normal, growing up. Does culture play a role in defining what trauma is and what trauma isn't?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, cultures. So we have also, the idea now, especially, it's been there for a long time, but we, now with all the social justice movements that are happening, we have this idea that people are becoming more aware of. Again, it existed already before, but racialized trauma, right? So we can talk about individuals, but we can also talk about entire cultures, entire communities that carry trauma. So we talk about war-torn countries, right? So I've seen clients who are the children of parents who grew up in a war-torn country. And so a culture in which, they basically, life was about literal survival. Emotions could not be attuned to, right? Emotions didn't matter. If you're, checking, surviving, making sure that your physical, the way that you're standing or walking doesn't seem threatening, and that's what you're attuned to, you're not going to have time to stop and think, oh, I'm really anxious right now and my heart's kind of racing and oh my God. You don't have time to have a panic attack. You're going to literally just be focused on surviving. Now, when those people come from that culture and they come to the US or to, they leave and refugees or seeking asylum, they're still going to have that adaptive coping mechanism from that culture, and they're going to, now their children are here, but so the needs are different. The emotional flourishing is different. What they need to survive in this environment is different. And so it's this, we've talked about intergenerational trauma, and then also cultural trauma, as you mentioned, just because it happens in a culture and just because it's widespread doesn't mean it's good for us. And we can see that now with, in the culture in which we live, right? Young people are, it's different, but they're overexposed to images and people and, certain body image and certain notions that are changing the way they think, changing the way they perceive themselves, right? The amount of depression in young girls, it's a cultural phenomenon. And just because everyone is doing it doesn't mean it's good for us. Same thing applies to our Eastern cultures, where it's a culture of criticism and constantly being put down and constantly being told that, if you did this well, you could have done better, and there's someone else who did better than you. How come such and such a son is that kind of, degree and you're this kind of degree? It happens, but it doesn't mean that it's okay, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't affect us just because it's happening more widespread.
All right. So, and I don't really mean to turn this into a lexicon issue, but aren't these things overcome by resilience and people who are, okay, so what, your parents criticized you? So what, your parents compared you to somebody that was more successful? Maybe that was just their way of lifting you up. Maybe that was just their way of encouraging you. Why is this trauma?
So it doesn't necessarily have to be trauma. The other thing that we have to remember that it is that trauma is subjective, right? in that what is overwhelming for me at a given point in time will not be overwhelming for someone else in a different context, with a different set of supports, with a different level of, strengths that they have, right? So I'm not saying that every child that's criticized or put down or compared is going to end up with trauma. That doesn't have to be the case. Some children will actually, that will become what drives them, and it'll work and it'll motivate them. And for some children, it will turn into trauma. And it really depends, because resilience is built, when we're able to kind of integrate all of these different aspects. So let's say there's a child who's, one of, 7 children, doesn't get a whole lot of attention. And that child is constantly compared. And that child also now feels anxious and not good enough and is socially excluded in school. There's a number of different factors. And all of these factors come together are going to weigh down on a child who's 7 differently than a child or an adult who's 22, perhaps, right? Same set of circumstances, depending developmentally where we are, as well as, within the context of who we are, right?
Got it. Another thing that people also bring up is, in these circumstances, shouldn't your Iman have protected you against this? I mean, Allah tells us in the Quran that we shall be tested. Maybe your test was your trauma, maybe it was your parents, was that critical parent, and Iman is supposed to come and help you in that case.
So my question, if someone was to ask me that, my question to them in response would be, who said they have to be mutually exclusive? A person can go through a very painful situation. Iman, most definitely our Iman can support us. It can help us. What I've seen happen, unfortunately, is that people who have had very unhealthy relationships, especially in their, early formative years, parents that were either verbally abusive or just not present. A lot of times the way that they see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gets colored by their early relationships. So if they grew up in relationships and homes where they felt, as an adult, they can say, oh, my parents, I know they cared about me and they both had to work. And, I know that I remind them, we're not blaming your parents. We're not saying that your parents were bad people or that they were bad parents. But as a result of having to be alone all the time, it had an impact. And as a child, there was a sense of there's nobody to care for me. And so now as an adult, that's what I mean. So we are at that age, that's what was processed, because children don't say, oh, my parents are bad. Children say, if something's happening around me, it must be my fault. The world revolves around them. And so that belief then turns into how they see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And then it becomes this belief that, oh, nobody cares about me. Allah doesn't care about me. Right. And so we have to see there's an interplay. Iman can strengthen us, but also trauma, I see a lot of times, can weaken people's faith. Right. And so we have to, the two are not mutually exclusive, but they do have an impact on each other.
Is it possible that people may be struggling with trauma and don't know it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you find that you have like a pattern in your behavior. So, for example, if you have a hard time maintaining friendships, if you find that you can't get, you're feeling emotionally disconnected from people, if you find that, like, let's say I have a client that anytime this person faces a person of authority, they rebel, right? I have a client that every time they have a goal in mind and they're running, doing everything to get to that goal. As soon as they get there, they self-sabotage, right? They do things that are just completely unprofessional or immoral and sabotage progress, right? So these patterns of behavior are what we're talking about, that, this is why we have to deal with it, to say, where is this coming from? What is it about, why am I always getting into a fight with everyone, right? So in trauma work with a client, I found that this person had just so much shame that was, being held from what this person experienced as a child. But that shame was being compensated for or covered up by anger, right? And so this person was getting into fights right and left, right? And had been abused as a child in some ways, was now becoming an abusive person, right? And so this person, this person is in therapy and happens to know that there's trauma, but there are so many people who have these cycles and these patterns of behavior that are detrimental either in their personal life or in their relationships, and they don't know why. Some people say, I always end up doing this, I don't know why. And that's where we say, okay, well, then what's going on there? What's the pattern of behavior and the belief system that's there that's creating this?
Got it. And I'm just thinking as a person who is in the field, but as an outsider. So here I am listening to somebody like Menahal, and she tells me that, maybe my issue is trauma related. Then I go to somebody who's into attachment theory, and they tell me maybe it was the way that your parents brought you. And maybe I go to somebody who's in psychoanalysis, and they go, maybe this is what's going on. So people are just wondering, as far as what we do in therapy, are you, when a person comes to you with these cases, are you specifically looking for trauma in their life? Is this what you would be doing?
So I don't assume about my clients, anything more than what they tell me. I try to fill in gaps, but I always leave the door open, and no one would know any of my clients because that's confidential. But if my clients were ever to say that, they can probably testify, all of them, that I always say, I could be wrong about this. I'm kind of seeing this here, but I could be wrong, because it's not my job as a therapist to be, it's unfair for me to expect that I'm the expert in your life. The work is collaborative, and there are many routes to get to the same place. What I find, and see, this is the thing, I think the word trauma is intimidating for a lot of people. And I think, if I say, okay, trauma, then, people, no, I didn't have trauma. There's something wrong. We think that trauma means there's something wrong with you. And that's not what it means. The way that I look at trauma work is that, look, we at some point in time had a situation to which that was overwhelming for our brain, that our body didn't, our brain and body didn't know how to process or deal with. So we adapted to it. We adapted to it by either fighting, by, escaping, maybe even just kind of mentally, like daydreaming, escaping. We dealt with it by becoming really quiet and subdued, almost becoming invisible. So it depends, we survived. And so those things worked at a certain time. Those were strengths that we had. And now, at a later time in life, our brain and body have created filters to say, I'm going to make sure that pain is never felt again. And so those protective parts of us are working overtime, right? And so it's about teaching our nervous system a different way of being in the world. That's how I look at it. So I'm not looking at it, I'm not looking at clients that come to me saying, oh, you have trauma, you're broken, how do I fix you? That's not the case. I'm saying, where's the pain? What's going on here that's creating this situation that you don't feel good about right now? You suffer from anxiety or insomnia or, substance abuse or depression, whatever it may be. How is this behavior? How is this maybe even involuntary, because trauma lives in the body? So how is this involuntary response actually a way of helping you deal with something else or protect you from something else? So it's really looking at it and saying, there's so much wisdom that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put in our brain and our body. And where the wounding occurs, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us incredible healing capacities. And so I see my job as working with clients to tap into their own strength and their own healing capacity, as opposed to saying, oh, you're broken and I have to fix you.
Well said, mashallah. So what did you mean when you say that trauma lives in the body? That statement just got me there.
Sure. So trauma, there's a very famous book for anyone who's interested in the topic by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. And essentially what this means is that our nervous system stores within the body memories, it stores emotion, the part of our brain that's connected to our movement. That's where trauma happens. Trauma does not happen in our cognitive mind, in our frontal lobe where we have narrative thinking. That's why a lot of times you might find yourself, if you've been hurt or something, or when I was a teacher before I was a therapist, the telltale sign of a child that's being abused is that when an adult comes near them, what are they going to do? Right? Involuntary. The body is reacting and responding to a perceived threat. And so when we look at trauma survivors, a lot of times we'll see that the body is responding to stimulus in a way that is not working in the environment that they're in. Right? But that's, again, an adaptive measure for something that happened to them before. So it's very much, we see that a lot of times, let's say, for example, a survivor of assault of some sort, they're, so that we're getting into a little bit of the mechanics of it, but the work that I do, which is called somatic therapy for working with trauma in addition to EMDR, we're kind of looking at, okay, what was the defense or survival strategy that could not be employed in that situation? So it might be that, that this person needed to defend themselves and push the predator away or push the attacker away. And so we're working with the body to say the body holds the wisdom to that. And I'm kind of following the lead. Actually, it's not just talk therapy. That's what makes trauma work different than talk therapy, is that we're actually saying, okay, I'm noticing what's coming up in the body. The person is maybe tensing up, and tensing, I'm saying, okay, is there a bracing happening? Is there something happening where the muscles are getting ready to move? And we actually, in trauma therapy, will say, okay, let's go ahead and just move the muscles, because the body is speaking to us. It's the language, the narrative of the body. And so we actually engage in movement of sorts to help the body maybe complete an action that couldn't be completed. Maybe it's a soothing that needs to happen that didn't, that hasn't happened before. So depending on the circumstances and the situations, we're actually tapping into a different part of the brain when we're looking at the body's response.
I think we just had, just
Oh,
froze there.
sorry. Yeah, I got frozen, so I didn't hear you. Sorry.
No. So you were telling us, I think you're finishing that thought about engaging the muscles and engaging the body when the client tenses up as a reaction.
Yeah. So, I'm looking at things like, if a client says, yeah, no, I'm totally fine, I don't care about that, and they're like totally tensed up, that's telling you, okay, I'll say, okay, I hear you saying that, but I'm noticing that there's something else going on here. Can we look at what's happening here? Right? What's happening, what wants to happen? And so that's really, really interesting how that leads to an entirely different way of looking at a person's response. And it's really beautiful and amazing how much wisdom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put into our bodies.
Nice. Well said. I remember when I was for a period of about 3 years, I was doing mental health assessment for refugees who came to the US. And most of these people, came from war-torn countries. And what we noticed is that within the first 90 days, they don't show any signs because they are in that survival mode that we spoke about. People are working on getting their license, looking for a job, getting their social security card, applying for their green card, and just like really, in that hustle and bustle type of a lifestyle. But then when everything settles, that is when their trauma, starts coming up. So this is really, really a fascinating topic. And
just to that point, just a quick point to that, in those kinds of situations, a lot of times people who have been through really severe situations, whether like refugees or someone who's been abused for a long time, for a lot of people like that, being safe is actually unsafe. So that's what, so when things settle, it's like, it's not okay to be safe because that's dangerous where they came from, right? If I was in a, may Allah protect us all, if someone grew up in a home where they're constantly being abused, let's say sexual abuse, for them to ever let their guard down and not be ready is actually dangerous. So, we find that that's what happens, is that if we, work on, say, okay, you're safe here. No, that's not, the nervous system reads that as danger. And so there's going to be actually more of a dysregulation in that situation.
Well said. And, apologies to our viewers out there. Sometimes when you bring up trauma and you speak about trauma, and, if whatever we're saying evokes certain emotions in you out there, please do take care of yourself. That may mean, you take a deep breath. It also may mean you tune us out and just say, right now, this is too intense for me to listen to. So our apologies if anybody's ever experiencing any of these things as a result of what is being brought up here. But nevertheless, man, this is like really, really beautiful work, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you for what you are doing. And I'm not sure how to now shift into marriage after addressing trauma. Some people might say that, that was the biggest trauma in their life, getting married. So in any case, and I know that people are just like getting ready. Valentine's Day is coming up in a few days. And please, this is not about whether it's halal, haram to celebrate Valentine's Day. We're just using the current events as talking points for what is going on. So you do work with couples. What are you seeing as far as marriages are concerned? And I think we're talking about marriages within the Muslim community. What are they like, and what are their challenges?
So marriages within the Muslim community, that, there's definitely, we still have a lot of cultural issues. Interestingly enough, even amongst couples that are married within the same culture, right? I think it's almost like people who marry someone from a different culture know that this is an issue that they're going to navigate. So they're more ready for it. And when they marry in the same culture, it's like they're shocked because they expected everything to be the same and they didn't expect, normal human differences. So, there are cultural issues, and just in terms of like communication styles, in terms of, also if we want to segue from trauma, the trauma that, people carry, right? Like if one person grew up in a family where emotions were never expressed and love was just expressed by, mom cooking and feeding you, and in the other, your spouse's family, love was expressed with hugs and cuddles and a lot of I love yous, you're going to have two very different ways of showing affection. And hugs and cuddles and I love yous are going to mean nothing to the spouse unless you cook for them and feed them, right? So, just these kinds of like different like nuances that we see in terms of what couples are bringing in. So that's, just like learning how to, I think one of the big pieces is learning how to have empathy. That's a big struggle for people, I've found, in marriages. You might be aware of the shift that, in the Gottman research, they show that couples have trouble for 6 years. 6 years of conflict in a relationship, typically, on average, before they actually seek help. So now you're coming into the therapist office, and the therapist is trying to say, okay, how can we listen to each other with empathy? But there's so much, built up pain. There's already so much anger that's just, stewing in, that it's really hard to listen. And I think that's a big piece of it, that having empathy and being able to, and so that's why I tell people is get, counseling for your relationship, premarital counseling before you get married. And, at the onset of any kind of a difficulty within the marriage, people say, no, it's not that bad. I say, that's the whole point. Get some intervention when it's not that bad, when you still actually like each other and care about each other and have the capacity to show empathy. When it gets that bad, you're going to be so angry, you're not going to want to listen to them. So that's a big piece that I see coming up, is that empathy is hard to develop when there's been so much conflict for a long time.
Okay, and I would love to get back to that point. However, the idea of, you said that it is an average of 6 years prior to people seeking counseling or seeking help. And just for any of our viewers, does that make a difference as far as when do you go to counseling? And the example that I give people is, look, you're driving your car, and every time you press on the brake, you hear noise, and you decide that you're going to dismiss it. You're not going to pay attention to it. You get a pain in your teeth and you decide that, you know what, it was not a big deal. You see your faucet dropping or dripping bits and pieces here and there, but you decide to ignore it. The longer the longer it takes for you to take care of that problem, the problem is really not getting any less. It's actually getting more intense. And that is why it could have just been a simple brake pads or a simple changing of a washer within the mechanics of the faucet, or just, a simple filling. Then all of the sudden we have to do a root canal. All of the sudden we need to change the entire brake system.
You're making me realize I have to call the dentist now.
Why does it take that long?
I think sometimes, one of the hardest things, I think, of calling a professional and getting intervention is that means we have to acknowledge that there's a problem. And acknowledging that there's a problem, I think that a lot of times there might be a fear that there's something wrong with me. A fear of maybe being exposed as not being good enough, right? So many of us hold these feelings of somehow being deficient or somehow, and we hear the criticism from our spouse. And, sometimes when there's constant fighting, the spouse might not realize how deep the criticism cuts. And so I think people wait because ignorance is bliss. If I actually call the dentist and they have to pull my tooth, I'm going to have to deal with the consequences of that for a couple of days, right? If I go to marriage counseling, I'm going to have to actually sit there and look at myself. And that's hard to do. In therapy, we're not just putting bandages on the situation. We're saying, let's open up the entire, wound and let's clean it out. That's a hard process. So, I can't blame people for not wanting to. But the thing is, as you mentioned, when the situation gets worse, it goes from something that could have been resolved, with a lot less intervention, with a lot more ease. But when it just gets that bad, it becomes that much harder to deal with.
In our training, I remember one of the first things that we were asked to do is when clients come in, is that you sincerely commend them for coming to therapy, because it takes a lot of courage and it takes a lot of humility to come and say, I have a problem, I need help. That takes a lot of courage. Yes. It's unbelievable. And that's why I tell my clients, man, that the first thing I do is truly, sincerely commend them for doing that.
Yep. And now every email inquiry that I get, my first response is always, thank you for reaching out. And it's a formality, but I say it genuinely because I know it's so hard to do that.
Yeah. And sometimes, people, be it a couple or be it an individual who come seeking help, they're coming in and to me, and I don't know, where you get your reward from. To me, counseling is a very self-rewarding profession, because the amount of trust that people grant you is just unbelievable. We're talking about people who just come in and say, look, I've never spoken about this to anybody, not my parents, not my spouse, not my kids, not my closest friends. You are the only person that I'm trusting with this information. And to me, that is so unbelievably incredible. And honestly speaking, I think it's the greatest honor I've ever received in my life, when people just say, look, I trust you.
Absolutely.
Please talk to my child. I trust you. And to me, it's like, oh my God, man, it is such an honor. And that's what.
And it's so humbling. Yeah.
It is unbelievable. It is unbelievable.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's exactly what you said, right? The fact that they're trusting you with the most vulnerable parts of themselves. It's really a trust and an honor. It really is. I agree with you 100%.
Yeah. And once again, for our viewers, if you have a question to Menahal, please do feel free to use the chat box on YouTube, and inshallah we'll get to it. Another thing also, he said that, you know what, we've got to open the wound and clean it up. Something that I found, and I just warn all my couples and my, individual clients, is that the first few sessions are the most difficult. And you really have got to be patient. And I think it's, the way that you just, you gave the imagery of it is like, look, this is going to be the pulling of the tooth. It may be the opening of the wounds and attempting to clean it. That is painful. And these are the first few sessions. This is what we're doing. People are opening that wound, they're exposing that wound. And people just leave, especially couples. They go, look, man, seems like the more we come to you, the worse it's getting. Because all we do is that we just talk about the things that we've been talking about, and we're not feeling any better. Does this counseling really work? And I tell them, look, you've been having issues for the past 10 years. Because you spoke to me once, it would be the most dishonest thing on my part to say that I can cure or I can claim to make things better because you spoke to me twice or three times. So is there a way around opening the wound and cutting through? Anything can be done about that?
Well, I mean, what I can say is that my attempt and what I work really hard to do is to only open it in small, tiny increments that are manageable. So I'm never looking to open up the whole thing and clean out all of it in one session. Especially when we're with couples, absolutely, because I don't want them to dump, 8, 10, 12 years of complaints into one session and just leave feeling like my husband or my wife hates me, right? We don't want to do that. And same thing with trauma, right? I don't want to activate the trauma in a person's nervous system. So we take it in what I call bite-sized pieces with, we're just going to pick one little thing right now. You had a fight. Does this fight feel like a pattern that keeps happening in your marriage, right? The same fight over and over again. Okay, let's look at this and let's understand what's happening here. How are both of you showing up in this fight that's keeping you stuck in this pattern, right? What is the stance that you're engaged in? And then how do we reverse that? How do we undo that and break the pattern, right? One little thing at a time. We're not looking at everything all the time.
Nice. All right. So you were identifying, helping us understand what is happening within these marriages. So you mentioned the cultural aspect, the differences in cultures, be they real cultures or family-related cultures. What else are you seeing? And you also mentioned the lack of empathy.
Yeah.
What else are you seeing there? And also, if you can say something about what you meant by that statement, the lack of empathy.
Sure. So, generally, I think sometimes, we aren't born with the tools of communication or ideal or the best communication, right? We learn how to communicate from the environment around us. And so a big piece, that I see is couples that they don't know how to effectively get their message across to each other. Something gets lost in translation. And so that's a lot of the work that I do with couples is to say, okay, and I can see one partner will start talking and the other one, their entire body language will start. And I'll say, hold on a second. Are you hearing this as criticism and as blaming? And it might be that, or it might not be that. And we want to really decipher what's the message inside, what you're saying. You've been saying this like this for 4, 5, 6, 7 years now. The same thing. It doesn't register. So we have to find a different way of getting that message across. So a lot of that's, a big piece of what I work on with couples. What I mean by the loss of empathy is, again, just over time, we are, as human beings, we're built to connect, right? We need our social connection, but we're also built to survive. And if we keep getting hurt, right, we're going to develop armor, figuratively speaking, that's going to keep people away from us, right? And when we do that, and a part of what can happen in relationships over time is I'm so ready to be hurt. I'm so ready to have to defend myself that I can't even listen. I'm not going to have compassion. If I'm getting ready for war, I'm not going to be like, yes, tell me exactly how you feel right now. I'm not going to do that. And so it's, when couples have been just going at it for so long or around a specific topic, let's say there's like, the sensitive topics, right? Couples often have like, every time we talk about this one topic, we get into a fight. It's because both of them are coming into it ready to battle. That's the preconceived notion. So there's no ability to actually connect and have empathy with the other person.
Got it. And that, of course, has a negative impact in the way that people relate or not relate to each other. All righty. So the culture, the loss of empathy. I think in the midst you also mentioned or alluded to communication. What else is going on in our marriages that is hurting us, or not being good in our relationship? And just keep in mind that as Menahel is collecting her thoughts there about this, there was a study that was done. I think it was in China. Once the quarantine and the lockdown was lifted, there was a rush for people to get divorced, and somehow people started blaming COVID for what is going on with the marriages, and COVID is resulting in these divorces. And somebody wrote, and I thought it was really, really brilliant, say that COVID did not really cause the divorce. COVID just expedited the process. So there was a specific trajectory that these relationships were heading to. COVID did not cause it, it expedited the process. So if people were going to, get divorced within 5 years, COVID just expedited that process, and now it just took place within 2 years. And it does not have to be something bad. It can also be something good. If people were planning on having a baby in, the next 4 years or after 4 years, just because of COVID, it just happened to be that they had their babies sooner. So they said it was the trajectory where the relationship was heading to, that was actually the main cause, and not necessarily, COVID was not the main cause, but it
And COVID
expedited.
just brought to the surface what was already there, because people couldn't run away from it. They couldn't distract themselves. They couldn't leave the house and go see friends and go to work and leave. Quite literally, the flight, mechanism within us. They couldn't do that. And so they were forced to confront what was already there. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things, Sheikh, to answer your question, another big thing that I see, and this is individuals and couples, but in the context of relationship, it becomes really hard when either or both partners don't know how or feel that they can't talk about their difficult emotions. So when they have a problem, when something is bothering them, a lot of times, again, stereotypically, not always, women are, are more likely to hold it in, and then just explode. And something that at that point seems like it's an unwarranted response. The response doesn't match the situation, and it's because they've been holding it in. So it's almost like, if we could learn how to speak about our difficult emotions, or about when small things are upsetting us, rather than holding it in, if we could find an effective way to communicate those things, it could help reduce, the bigger blow-ups, right? And also, a lot of times what we see, again, this is stereotypical, and I often see the reverse to be true as well. But again, generally speaking, men are the ones in the relationship who withhold their emotions, shut off, right? And the more the man shuts off, the more the woman is like, because both of them are shutting off or getting anxious because of that disconnect. I'm not being heard. I'm not being seen. I don't feel safe right now. I'm not gonna, I'm gonna receive criticism. I'm gonna be blamed. And so there's, again, the patterns that emerge as a result, right? So not knowing how to discuss our most, our pains and our difficulties, I think really contributes a lot to this as well.
Okay, so when you speak about being able to communicate our difficult emotions, what do you mean by that? What is a difficult emotion?
I mean, even just the simplest thing, right? So you, let's say, for example, a woman wanted her husband to pick up some groceries on the way home from work, right? The kids are home, or she, now with COVID, just go out and pick up some groceries. You're working from home, right? And, he goes and he gets the wrong stuff, or he forgets the most, the milk, the most important thing, and he always does this. And he seems to like just not listen, right? And, so rather than just being like, okay, whatever, and just continuing and, go get the milk herself or something like that, or just make do without it, and then having that accrue over time, if instead of that, she was to say, look, I know you're tired. I know you've been working all day in front of a screen, and I get that. But when I ask you to get groceries, I'm really depending on you. And when you forget stuff, I feel like you're not even listening to me. I'm tired too. And so I need you to actually write down the list so that you don't forget things, right? Like, it's at that point she can speak to it in a way that's actually appropriate for the situation, right? So yeah, those kinds of little things, right? I have a couple where we kind of stumbled upon. I always ask couples what has been going well at the start of our sessions, because we want to also learn the strengths, what worked, and build on those, and we stumbled across, one spouse said, when my partner, just sees that I'm upset, and rather than saying, oh no, why are you, not why are you, so like starting to react to me being upset and getting upset in response, just literally says 2 words to me: what's wrong? It means the world to me. And it's just like being able to verbalize that. When I get upset, I need you to ask me what's wrong. That'll just melt and like quite literally, that's been like something that has been employed in the relationship. And alhamdulillah, this couple went from meeting every week to every other week, not that it's not the only thing that worked, alhamdulillah. But, my point is just being able to figure out, here's a big thing, being able to figure out what I need is just as important in the relationship, as understanding what it is that hurts me. I know what bothers me, but being able to figure out why it bothers me is crucial. And sometimes partners don't do that hard work of saying, what is it about this that really gets under my skin? And if they don't get there, then they can't express to their spouse, say, I feel unappreciated. I feel undervalued. I feel like you don't care about me. If they they don't understand what it is that they're feeling, they'll never be able to express it. So that's a big piece of a big part of the work that we do as well.
As you're talking, and I found this to be, as a therapist, most marriage difficulties they're not necessarily the result of big stuff. It is mainly the result of a lot of little stuff that's just been going on for so long. Not saying that big stuff are not happening, but it was just a lot of little stuff. Like the examples that you're giving, these are real examples.
Absolutely.
And I can tell you that many of our viewers out there, they can relate to this. For example, are you always fighting about the same thing over and over and over again, and you get nowhere? And even outsider were to listen to this conversation, guys, what's the big deal? Like, where is the big deal here? And I tell people, say, look, man, things, it's not the big things that are going to eat out at you, but it's going to be these little things that will just keep, eating away at the relationships. And you're talking about, for us to just be able to verbalize these difficult feelings, or for somebody to just say, what's wrong? My favorite is, how are you doing? That's like my favorite thing. Just checking in on people and just say, how are you doing? I don't want to talk about the kids. I don't want to talk about the work. I don't want to talk about your school, not your exams, not your friends. I just want to talk about you. I'm not talking about your health. I'm talking about just your well-being. Like, are you well? Is your heart well? Is your mind well? How are you doing? I find that to be, I really wish people can just ask me that, like, how are you doing?
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
what is it about these little things?
I think it's the pebbles that make the mountains, right? as in, you know better than me, Sheikh, the hadith about the Prophet ﷺ and, advising Aisha radiallahu anha to beware of the small sins. It's the little everyday interactions that start to shape how we feel, how we, view relationships, how we view a situation. It's the little things that happen over and over. If it was one big thing, then, bam, you don't need and also the other thing is that, these are some of our most closest, deepest, vulnerable relationships, and so the pain that we get from those, if someone says, oh my God, you're so annoying, and like rolls their eyes at you outside on the street, you can just kind of brush it off. But if your spouse says that to you, it's going to hurt 10 times more or 100 times more, because this is our oxygen. Our survival is built on having these connections. And so it's the little things that build up over time. And, it's because these relationships are important to us that it hurts so much.
Nice. Menahal, we have about 3 minutes left. And we want to make sure that we give our viewers, we want to give them tips. Okay, so we have families listening to this. Okay, based on what you have seen, based on your work, what would you say to these families? Like, how can I, few tips that I can improve my relationships with my family members?
Sure. So the one thing that I'll say, practically speaking, is pay attention to how you start a conversation. If you're starting the conversation with harshness, with criticism, that's one of the predictors of that Dr. Gottman uses to say, he just observes couples and how they talk to each other about a problem. And if they start talking about the problem in a very, critical, harsh way, the chances are that conversation is not going to go well, right? And also then you start, engaging in putting the person down and instead of putting the problem down, right? So the example I gave earlier about the milk and the forgotten, groceries, there's a big difference between saying, you're just so irresponsible versus, it really bothers me when you forget things on the list. And one is putting the person down, and one is complaining about the actual problem. Right? So beware of that. And I think, for families that are listening across the board, watch how you're speaking to people. If you're making a blanket statement, a negative statement about who that person is, that pain cuts really deep. And it shapes, and especially if there are parents listening about the children, it shapes how your child or your spouse sees themselves in the world. Right? And so beware of that. You want to think about, how do you start with, in a softer way, right? So the example that I gave, I purposely said, look, I know that you've been working hard all day. I know that you're tired, right? And maybe you just kind of space out, and you can just space out when you go out to the grocery store. I get that. So there's some compassion there. There's a softness there. There's a willingness to say, okay, you're not a horrible person. I get that you're working hard. And so if that, if just starting there, pay attention to how you start the difficult conversations. If you jump right into blaming, if you jump right into sarcasm, if you jump right into putting a person down, the likelihood is you're not going to achieve your goal. You're not going to get to a solution, and you're going to leave this person that you love with a lot of pain.
Beautiful, mashallah. And I know that this is such a very Quranic approach, and I've always found this verse to be just absolutely beautiful, where Allah would command and say, وَقُولُوا لِلنَّاسِ حُسْنًا. And when you speak to people, use the best of speech. وَقُلْ لِعِبَادِي يَقُولُ الَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. And tell my servants to use the best of speech. It's not just using good words. Allah said, use the best of speech. Menahal, this has been a really, really beautiful conversation. We appreciated you, just staying up this late talking to us. And this was really, really lovely. And now I want you to promise me and promise our viewers, inshallah, that you will be back again.
Inshallah. You just let me know when.
Inshallah. And to all of our viewers, we appreciated you being here with us. And as we always like to end, if any of us or our loved ones are not feeling well, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us a speedy recovery. If any of us or our loved ones are going through difficult times, may Allah ease our pain. If any of our loved ones have passed away, may Allah bless their souls. If any of us or our loved ones have lost the way, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring us back to His way, Ya Rabbil Alameen. Until then, please be safe. Until we see you again, we say so long and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة